Chinese leader Xi Jinping touched down in Moscow Monday for a three-day meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and what both nations say is a chance to further their, quote, no-limits friendship.
The rendezvous comes just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for allegedly committing crimes against Ukrainian children, specifically the unlawful deportation and transfer from Ukraine to the Russian Federation.
Journalist Caitlin Johnstone was just one Twitter user to question whether it's fair to prosecute Putin. Quote, "It's not a whataboutism to say it's absurd to charge Putin with war crimes without charging Bush. It's a completely devastating argument against the claim being made. If the law doesn't apply to everyone, then it's not the law, it's just corruption. It's a tool of the powerful." Journalist Glenn Greenwald joined in, adding, quote, "Whataboutism is the word they fed to the world's dumbest people to bar inquiry into whether they and their side abide by the standards they impose on others. I'm enraged. Trump embraced Saudi tyrants. Unprecedented. Obama, Biden, and Clinton did the same. Whataboutism." So, yeah, I was thinking a lot about this because there are a lot of things you could potentially charge Vladimir Putin with, right? A lot of war crimes, a lot of crimes he's committed. He's, notorious for poisoning his opposition and jailing them and so forth. But this specific charge of moving children from Ukraine to Russia seems to me a little bit odd. I think specifically, from what I can tell, a lot of the children are from Donetsk, which at the start of this conflict was not officially part of Ukraine, right? Even under the Minsk Accords, it was a contested area that was an independent republic. So I don't even know that it's correct to say they were moved from Ukraine to Russia. They were moved from Donetsk to Russia. And then there was another story about children who were in Mariupol who were found sort of in a bunker under a destroyed building. I mean, was he just supposed to leave them there? I'm not necessarily defending this, but it's just of all of the crimes one could leverage against Putin, this seems to me a very bizarre one to hang such a large investigation on.
Yeah, Putin is a thug who is operating outside the bounds of the law because he launched this invasion of Ukraine. But they have, I think you're making a totally correct point, that they've pegged it to something very specific. It's a little bit harder to prove than you might think. And in fact, the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, the U.S. has all sorts of problems with. We are not part of this. We're not involved in this. The Obama administration had pledged to cooperate with it. The Biden administration, and then Trump has criticized it, 6 ways to Sunday. Biden and Antony Blinken have maintained that we have these longstanding issues with it, so people have criticized this thing on all sides of the political spectrum. There's a kind of, I think, left criticism of it as well, that it's really only previously been focused on injustices in Africa, African warlords, dictators, after the fact, not when it could still do something when they're in office, and has overlooked crimes committed in the Western sphere.
Yeah, look, there might be a relationship between what they've chosen to charge Putin with and the fact that a lot of powerful Western nations don't want to be implicated in any charges from the ICC, even though that they have also engaged in war crimes. So one reporter at Al Jazeera wrote that he is glad that the ICC has charged Putin with a war crime. He has earned it, but it's also deeply hypocritical. He wrote, quote, "There are other leaders of other nations, including the United States and Israel, who regard themselves as exempt from the ICC's authority and who have also earned being charged with war crimes by the court." Apparently, according to the ICC, a cocksure British prime minister and his soldiers who joined their evangelical American cousins to invade Iraq and Afghanistan, destroying countless towns and cities, don't count. I'm abbreviating that. So-called elite Australian soldiers who murdered scores of Afghan civilians, don't count. A slew of Israeli prime minister soldiers and their proxies who have targeted Palestinian kids, women, and children, don't count. So he lists all of these other things which have been credibly described as war crimes by other governments, but the difference seems to be who is doing it when it comes to the accountability of these kind of international organizations.
Well, I think it's funny to say they've evaded the authority of the ICC. The ICC has no authority, right? It's an international body that is purely symbolic in nature, right? I mean, again, you cannot have a legal system without a nation state. So it's funny to talk about evading authority, like when it doesn't actually have any. But I think this is it's very curious. I mean, I understand that we are all Ukraine now and so forth, and Putin is supposed to be treated and spoken about in a certain way, and we can all acknowledge that he has done horrible, awful things. But this one particular one, I find it very curious that they've chosen to hang their hats on this.
And again, there are conservative and libertarian criticisms as well of the ICC. ICC, including that it does not actually have certain due process protections, that there's no right to a jury trial. So one of the arguments against U.S. support or involvement with this body is that it would actually obligate us to violate our own U.S. Bill of Rights because we have more guarantees than this body has.
I mean, this is the problem with international law.
Yeah.
The United States routinely chooses not to engage when it would implicate our domestic policy, sometimes in good ways. So we won't sign on to the Universal Declaration for the Rights of the Child because we won't guarantee certain things like housing and health care to people in our country that other people will. This is also giving me vibes about the Nord Stream pipeline situation, where what do we have in terms of international organizations who can conduct an independent investigation that isn't being conducted by the people who are implicated in the blast when you have Russia made a request for the UN to conduct an independent investigation. The United States and its allies shut that down. And so the question becomes, well, then who? And ultimately, this idea of international law, in many ways, when it's unenforceable, does become a fiction, which again begs the question of why it is that America is able to continue to grandstand on Putin violating international law. I think nobody is disputing that the invasion of Ukraine was improper, but then what do you do with other kinds of impropriety on the behalf of Americans, or other countries, like potentially bombing our allies' infrastructure in Nord Stream?
Right. International and specifically European law is very different on free speech also. For instance, that's one reason to be a little wary of getting overly involved in international organizations. They take a totally different view of the trade-off between free speech and privacy. There's no First Amendment in Europe. They can jail you for hate speech, et cetera, and so on and so forth. We don't do that. We think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. A lot of people in the U.S. think that's a good thing. So,
but not everybody anymore.
Not everybody anymore. But so I think, as you both said, let's condemn Putin. Let's be very unhappy about what he's doing. But the specifics of this one are a little weird.
Oh, it's worth noting before we leave this, what the major implication of this is going to be for Putin is that he can't travel. Is that there's this risk that if he goes to travels that would extradite him for these crimes, that he could be arrested. So what does this mean also in terms of the desire for diplomacy and his ability to meet with people and actually come to some resolution in Ukraine if there are any number of countries that he literally cannot go to without risk of actually being
I wonder
arrested.
what his vaccine status is if he's trying to come to the U.S.
Robby.
If he wants to play tennis, we'd have to double check that.
All right.
Now, wouldn't we? More Rising right after this. Please stay tuned.